The most important person in the diner was the one nobody thought belonged there. Morning sunlight streamed through the large front windows of Miller's Diner, painting long golden rectangles across the black and white tile floor. The smell of fresh coffee, toasted bread, and sizzling bacon drifted through the air, while country music played softly from an old speaker above the counter. Customers chatted between bites of breakfast. Waitresses moved quickly between booths, and the town seemed to be settling into another ordinary day. At a corner table, near the window sat Walter Brooks, a 78-year-old black man, wearing a neatly pressed brown jacket and a light blue shirt. His silver hair was trimmed carefully, and his posture remained straight despite his age. In front of him sat a cup of coffee and a simple breakfast that had barely been touched. Every few minutes, Walter would glance down at an old pocket watch resting in his weathered hands. The brass surface had been polished so many times that it reflected the morning light like gold. He would open it briefly, study something inside, then close it again with a quiet smile. The waitress, Linda, had noticed the ritual several times already. "Everything all right this morning, Mr. Brooks?" she asked warmly while refilling his coffee. Walter nodded. "Everything is exactly as it should be." Linda smiled and continued her work. Not everyone in the diner shared her kindness. A few customers sitting near the counter had been watching Walter since he arrived. They exchanged whispers and suspicious glances. One man frowned whenever he looked toward the corner booth. Another customer kept glancing at Walter's worn jacket and old watch as though trying to figure out why he was there. Walter seemed completely unaware. Or perhaps he noticed and simply chose not to react. He continued sitting quietly, occasionally looking through the window toward the bright blue sky beyond the parking lot. Time passed. The conversations around the diner grew louder. Then one customer stood and walked toward the manager near the cash register. Their conversation remained quiet, but the manager's expression slowly changed. He glanced toward Walter. Then he looked away. Then he looked back again. A feeling of discomfort began spreading through the room. Linda noticed it immediately. She also noticed Walter sitting peacefully at his table, completely different from the picture being painted by the rumors moving through the diner. 10 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot outside. Several customers turned toward the windows. Others stopped eating. The manager straightened his shirt nervously. Walter simply lifted his coffee cup and took a slow sip. The bell above the front door rang softly as Officer Ryan Mitchell entered the diner. The room became noticeably quieter. Ryan scanned the restaurant until his eyes settled on the elderly man sitting alone by the window. Walter looked up from his coffee and met the officer's gaze. Neither man spoke. The sunlight reflected across the pocket watch resting beside Walter's plate. Ryan began walking toward the corner table while every customer in the diner watched. Walter closed the watch gently and placed it in his jacket pocket. Then he offered the officer a calm, polite smile as if he had been expecting him all along. Officer Ryan Mitchell stopped beside Walter Brooks's table and studied him carefully. The entire diner seemed to lean toward the corner booth without moving an inch. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Forks rested above plates. Conversations disappeared into silence. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter and the soft country music from the overhead speaker remained. Walter looked up at the officer with calm eyes and folded his hands neatly on the table. There was no fear in his expression, no irritation, no urgency. It was the kind of composure that made people uncomfortable when they expected something else. Ryan glanced briefly toward the manager, who stood near the register pretending not to watch. Then he returned his attention to Walter. "Good morning, sir." Walter nodded politely. "Good morning, officer." The answer was warm and respectful. Ryan pulled out a small notebook. "I received a call regarding a concern here this morning." Walter listened quietly. "I see." Ryan waited for more, but none came. The silence stretched for several seconds. Around them, curious eyes remained fixed on the table. Finally, Ryan continued. "Would you mind answering a few questions?" Walter gestured toward the empty seat across from him. "Please." The invitation caught Ryan off guard. Most people became defensive when approached by law enforcement. Walter simply treated him like a guest. Ryan remained standing. "How long have you been here today?" "About 40 minutes. Are you meeting someone?" Walter glanced toward the front windows where sunlight reflected across parked cars outside. "Eventually." Ryan frowned slightly. "Eventually?" Walter smiled. "Yes." The answer sounded simple, but somehow it raised more questions than it answered. Ryan noticed several customers watching closely. He straightened his posture. "Do you come here often?" Walter looked around the diner. His eyes lingered on old photographs hanging along the wall. Pictures of high school football teams, community fundraisers, Veterans Day breakfasts, decades of local history framed beneath glass. "Longer than most people realize," Walter said quietly. Ryan followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual. "Do the employees know you?" Walter nodded toward Linda, who was carrying a tray of coffee cups across the room. "Some do." Linda smiled faintly when she heard that. Ryan wrote something in his notebook. Then his attention shifted to the pocket watch partially visible near Walter's jacket pocket. The elderly man seemed almost protective of it. "That watch appears important." Walter reached into his pocket and carefully removed it. The brass surface glowed beneath the morning sunlight. He opened it briefly and looked inside. A softness entered his eyes. Then he closed it again. "It is." Ryan waited. Walter offered no further explanation. Across the diner, whispers started again. The mystery surrounding the old man seemed to grow with every answer. Yet Walter appeared perfectly comfortable. He took another sip of coffee and looked out the window. Ryan found himself studying him more closely now. There was something unusual about the way Walter carried himself. Not wealth, not authority, something deeper. The confidence of a man who had already lived through moments far more important than this one. And as the sunlight reflected once more from the old pocket watch resting in Walter's hand, Ryan began to realize that the answers he was looking for might not be found in any notebook. Officer Ryan Mitchell slipped his notebook back into his pocket, but he did not leave. Something about Walter Brooks continued pulling his attention back to the elderly man sitting quietly by the window. The diner had resumed some of its activity, yet the atmosphere remained tense. Conversations were softer now. Customers still glanced toward the corner booth whenever they thought nobody was watching. Walter seemed completely unaffected by it all. He sat comfortably in the morning sunlight, one hand resting near his coffee cup and the other lightly touching the old pocket watch. Outside, traffic moved steadily along Main Street. Inside, time felt strangely slower. Ryan remained beside the table. "You said you were waiting for someone." Walter nodded. "That is right." "Family?" Ryan asked. Walter smiled faintly. "In a way." The answer only deepened the mystery. Ryan looked around the diner again. Every person there appeared ordinary. Truck drivers finishing breakfast. Retirees discussing local news. Young parents trying to keep children entertained. Nothing about the scene suggested anything unusual. Yet Walter carried himself as though he knew something nobody else did. Linda approached with a fresh pot of coffee. "Can I top that off for you, Mr. Brooks?" Walter thanked her politely and slid his cup forward. Ryan noticed the familiarity between them. Not close friendship. Something older. Something built through years of small interactions. "You know him well?" Ryan asked after Linda stepped away. "Long enough to know he never causes trouble." The waitress returned to her duties, leaving Ryan with another unanswered question. Walter lifted the pocket watch once more. This time Ryan noticed that he opened it only briefly before closing it again. The motion was careful, almost reverent. "Was it your father's?" Ryan asked. For the first time, Walter looked genuinely surprised. Then he smiled. "Yes." Ryan nodded slowly. "I thought so." Walter's eyes drifted toward the front window. "He gave it to me many years ago." The sunlight reflected softly across the brass casing. "He told me there would come a day when it would remind me why patience matters." Ryan frowned. "That sounds important." Walter chuckled quietly. "At the time, I did not think so." Several customers nearby were openly listening now. Nobody interrupted. Nobody wanted to. The old man's voice carried the weight of experience. Every sentence sounded like part of a story that had started long before anyone in the diner arrived. Ryan found himself becoming less suspicious and more curious. That realization bothered him slightly. He was supposed to be gathering facts. Instead, he was listening. Walter looked at the watch again. A warmth entered his expression that seemed connected to a memory only he could see. "My father believed people reveal themselves when they think nobody important is watching." Ryan considered the statement carefully. Before he could respond, the manager suddenly emerged from his office near the register. His face looked different now. Tense. Distracted. He stared at the telephone mounted on the wall behind the counter as though expecting it to ring. Walter noticed immediately. So did Ryan. The manager checked his wristwatch, looked toward Walter, then glanced back at the telephone. A strange feeling settled over the room. Nobody understood why. Yet somehow it felt as though something was approaching. Something larger than a complaint call. Something that would soon change the way every person inside Miller's diner saw the elderly man sitting quietly beside the window. The manager remained near the register, pretending to organize receipts that clearly did not need organizing. Every few seconds his eyes drifted back toward the telephone mounted on the wall. The behavior did not go unnoticed. Officer Ryan Mitchell watched him carefully. So did several customers. Even Walter Brooks seemed aware of it, though he showed no sign of concern. He sat quietly beside the window with his coffee growing cold and the old pocket watch resting in his hand. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher above Main Street. Inside, the atmosphere continued to tighten. Ryan looked toward the manager. Everything all right? The manager forced a smile that lasted less than a second. Of course. Ryan did not believe him. Neither did anyone else. Walter slowly closed the pocket watch and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. The familiar motion seemed to calm him. Linda arrived with a fresh pot of coffee and paused beside the table. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Brooks?" Walter smiled warmly. "No, thank you. Breakfast was perfect." Linda glanced toward Ryan and then toward the manager. She sensed the tension spreading through the diner. Everyone did. Yet Walter remained the only person in the room who appeared completely comfortable. That detail bothered Ryan more than he cared to admit. "You seem very relaxed for someone at the center of all this attention," Ryan said. Walter looked out the window. "Attention comes and goes. Most people would be upset." Walter nodded. "Most people spend too much time worrying about what strangers think." The answer lingered in Ryan's mind. Around them, customers continued listening. The elderly man spoke softly, yet somehow every sentence carried across the room. A truck driver near the counter lowered his newspaper. A retired couple stopped talking entirely. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Ryan pulled out a chair and finally sat down across from Walter. The decision surprised the room. It surprised Ryan as well. Somewhere during the last 20 minutes, the conversation had changed. This no longer felt like an investigation. It felt like a puzzle. Walter noticed the shift immediately. "You have questions," he said. Ryan nodded. "A few." Walter smiled. "That is healthy." Ryan looked toward the pocket watch. "What is inside it?" For the first time all morning, Walter hesitated. Not from fear. From thoughtfulness. He placed a hand over the pocket where the watch rested. A reminder. Of what? Walter's eyes softened. Of people who believed this country could become better than it was. Ryan studied him carefully. The answer sounded personal. Important. Yet it revealed almost nothing. Before he could ask another question, the sharp ring of the telephone suddenly echoed through the diner. Every conversation stopped instantly. The manager froze. Customers turned toward the counter. Even the kitchen staff looked through the service window. The telephone rang again. Then again. The manager swallowed hard and hurried toward it. Walter calmly reached for his coffee. Ryan noticed something extraordinary. The elderly man was smiling. Not because the situation was funny. Because he seemed to know exactly who might be calling. The manager lifted the receiver with trembling fingers. "Miller's Diner," he said. The expression on his face changed almost immediately. His eyes widened. The color drained from his cheeks. Slowly, very slowly, he turned toward Walter Brooks. The manager stood frozen behind the counter, gripping the telephone receiver so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. Every eye in the diner remained fixed on him. The room had become so quiet that the faint hiss of the coffee machine sounded unusually loud. Officer Ryan Mitchell slowly rose from his chair. Walter Brooks remained seated by the window, calm and unhurried, as though the call had arrived exactly when he expected it. The manager listened for several more seconds before speaking. "Yes, sir." His voice was suddenly much more respectful than before. "Yes, he is here." Several customers exchanged nervous glances. Ryan watched carefully. Something significant was happening. The manager swallowed hard and looked directly at Walter. Then he nodded repeatedly toward the telephone. "Of course, sir. Right away." When the call ended, he lowered the receiver slowly. For a moment, he simply stared at Walter. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Finally, the manager stepped away from the counter and approached the corner booth. His expression had completely changed. The uncertainty was gone. In its place was something closer to disbelief. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly. Walter looked up from his coffee. Yes. The manager hesitated. Someone would like to speak with you. Several customers leaned forward. Ryan frowned. Who was on the phone? The manager looked at him, then back at Walter. I was instructed to hand the call directly to Mr. Brooks. Walter smiled faintly. Not proudly. Not dramatically. Simply as though an old appointment had arrived on schedule. He stood slowly from the booth, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the counter. The old pocket watch remained tucked safely inside his coat pocket. As he passed through the diner, dozens of eyes followed him. The same people who had spent the morning questioning his presence were now watching him with growing confusion. Walter accepted the telephone receiver. Walter Brooks speaking. His voice remained calm. Whatever came through the line immediately softened his expression. Good morning, he said warmly. A pause followed. Then he laughed quietly. The sound surprised everyone. It was genuine. Familiar. Like he was speaking with an old friend. Ryan found himself staring. Nothing about this situation made sense anymore. Walter listened for nearly a minute. Occasionally he nodded. Once he glanced out the window, toward the bright morning sky. Then he touched the pocket watch through his jacket and smiled again. The gesture did not go unnoticed. Several customers saw it. Ryan saw it too. Whatever connection existed between the watch and the mysterious caller was clearly important. Finally, Walter spoke again. That is very kind of you. I will be there. Another pause. Then a final smile. Thank you. Please tell everyone I appreciate the invitation. He gently returned the receiver to its cradle and stood quietly beside the counter. The manager looked as though he had forgotten how to speak. Ryan stepped forward. Mr. Brooks, he said carefully, who was that? Walter looked toward him. For a brief moment, sunlight reflected from the diner windows across his face. He reached into his pocket and removed the old brass watch. Then he opened it. Inside was a small faded photograph that nobody had seen before. Walter studied the image for a second before closing the watch again. Someone remembering a promise, he said softly. And somehow that answer created even more questions than the telephone call itself. Walter Brooks stood quietly beside the counter with the pocket watch resting in his hand. The diner remained frozen in a strange silence. Even after the telephone call had ended, nobody seemed willing to return to normal conversation. Every customer wanted answers. Every pair of eyes followed the elderly man. Yet Walter appeared completely at peace. He closed the watch carefully and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. The faded photograph hidden inside remained a mystery. Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped closer. His earlier confidence had begun to fade, replaced by genuine curiosity. A promise, he asked. Walter nodded. A very old one. Ryan waited for more. None came. The answer hung in the air like so many others Walter had given throughout the morning. Meaningful, honest, incomplete. The manager finally found his voice. Mr. Brooks, he said carefully. The caller seemed very eager to speak with you. Walter smiled. I imagine they were. The response only deepened everyone's confusion. Linda stood near the coffee station pretending to polish mugs while openly listening. Several customers had abandoned any attempt to hide their interest. Even the cook peered through the service window. Walter slowly returned to his booth by the window and sat down. Sunlight spilled across the tabletop, illuminating the untouched portion of his breakfast. He looked outside for a moment before reaching once again for the pocket watch. Ryan noticed immediately. The object had become the center of the entire mystery. Walter opened it gently. This time he did not hide the photograph inside. From where Ryan stood, he could see only a glimpse. An old image. Two young men standing together. One of them appeared to be Walter decades earlier. The other face remained difficult to make out. The photograph looked worn from years of handling. Your friend? Ryan asked. Walter studied the picture for several seconds. Someone who changed history. The answer landed heavily. Several customers exchanged puzzled looks. Ryan folded his arms. You keep saying things like that. Walter laughed softly. Only because they happen to be true. Outside, a breeze moved through the American flags hanging from nearby storefronts. The morning sunlight brightened the diner windows. Everything felt unusually still, as though the town itself was waiting. Walter closed the watch once more and rested it beside his coffee cup. You know, he said quietly, there was a time when nobody believed certain things could ever change. Ryan listened carefully. What kind of things? Walter's eyes drifted toward the photograph hidden inside the watch. The important kind. Before Ryan could continue, The manager's cell phone suddenly began ringing. The sound startled nearly everyone in the diner. The manager glanced at the screen and immediately froze. His expression changed even faster than it had during the telephone call. He stared at the display for several seconds before answering. "Hello." His voice came out almost as a whisper. As he listened, his eyes widened. Then he looked directly at Walter. This time there was no confusion in his face, only disbelief. Around the diner, customers sensed something extraordinary unfolding. Ryan followed the manager's gaze toward Walter. The elderly man simply lifted his coffee cup and took a calm sip. It was the expression of someone who had spent a lifetime carrying a secret and knew that, sooner or later, the truth always arrived exactly when it was supposed to. The manager lowered his cell phone slowly, as though the device had suddenly become much heavier than before. The silence inside Miller's diner deepened. Every customer was watching him now. Even the clinking dishes from the kitchen had stopped. The entire room seemed suspended between questions and answers. Walter Brooks remained seated by the window, his coffee cup resting calmly in front of him. Morning sunlight illuminated the silver strands of his hair and reflected softly across the brass surface of the pocket watch beside his plate. Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped toward the manager. "What is going on?" he asked quietly. The manager looked at him, then looked at Walter. For several seconds he appeared unable to decide which direction to face. Finally, he cleared his throat. The call was from Washington. A murmur moved through the diner. Ryan frowned. "Washington?" The manager nodded. "Yes." Several customers exchanged puzzled glances. Nobody knew what to make of the statement. Walter simply sat quietly. The calm expression on his face had not changed all morning. The manager swallowed hard. They asked if Mr. Brooks was still here. The room became even quieter. Ryan looked toward Walter. "Who exactly called?" The manager hesitated. Then he answered, "A senior office connected to the executive residence." The words landed like stones in still water. Confusion spread through the diner. Some customers did not understand the significance. Others understood immediately. Walter slowly lifted the pocket watch and turned it over in his hands. Ryan stared at him. "Mr. Brooks," he said carefully, "what exactly is happening?" Walter smiled gently. "Nothing unexpected." That answer only intensified the mystery. Linda moved closer to the booth. So did several customers. Nobody wanted to miss another word. Walter looked down at the watch. His thumb rested against the edge of the brass cover. For a moment, he seemed far away, lost in a memory that existed decades before this morning. Then he opened the watch once again. This time the photograph inside caught the sunlight. Ryan finally saw it clearly. Two young men standing shoulder to shoulder many years ago. One was unmistakably a younger Walter Brooks. The other man wore a confident smile that looked strangely familiar. Ryan stared at the image. Something about the face triggered recognition. Before he could place it, Walter spoke. "That photograph was taken over 50 years ago." His voice was quiet enough that everyone leaned closer. "A lot has changed since then." Ryan looked at the picture again. Then suddenly his eyes widened. He recognized the second man, not from personal experience, from history books, documentaries, presidential libraries. The realization struck him so quickly that he nearly forgot to breathe. Several customers saw his reaction and immediately turned toward the photograph. Walter closed the watch gently. "Some promises take a long time to keep," he said. The manager looked stunned. Linda covered her mouth with one hand. Across the diner, people were beginning to understand that the elderly man they had spent the morning questioning was connected to a story far larger than anyone imagined. Outside, sunlight filled the parking lot. Inside, every assumption that had existed an hour earlier was quietly collapsing. And for the first time all morning, Officer Ryan Mitchell realized that Walter Brooks had never been the most ordinary person in the room. He had been the most extraordinary. The realization spread through Miller's diner one person at a time. First Officer Ryan Mitchell, then the manager, then Linda. Finally, the customers who had spent the entire morning whispering among themselves. Nobody spoke for several seconds because nobody knew what to say. Walter Brooks remained seated by the window exactly as he had been since the beginning. The same coffee cup, the same pocket watch, the same calm dignity. Only now the room was seeing him differently. Ryan slowly pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. The confidence that had marked their first conversation was gone. In its place was respect. Genuine respect. Walter noticed the change immediately, but said nothing. He simply rested the pocket watch on the table between them. Morning sunlight reflected across the brass cover. "You knew this entire time," Ryan said quietly. Walter smiled. "I knew the truth." Ryan glanced toward the watch. "The man in that photograph." Walter nodded. "A friend. More than a friend." Walter looked out the window for a moment. Cars passed along Main Street. Life continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "A young man with big dreams," Walter said softly. "Before the world knew his name." The manager approached the table carefully. "Mr. Brooks, I owe you an apology." Walter looked up. "For what?" The manager lowered his eyes. "For assuming things." Several customers nearby suddenly became very interested in their coffee cups. Walter noticed. His expression remained warm. "Assumptions are easy," he said. "Understanding takes longer." The words settled across the room. No accusation. No bitterness. Just truth. Ryan looked at him carefully. "The call from Washington." Walter nodded. "Yes. They are expecting you?" Walter smiled. "They have been expecting me for quite some time." The manager looked stunned. Linda stood quietly nearby listening. Walter opened the pocket watch once more. This time he turned it slightly so those closest could see the photograph. The faded image showed two young men standing together outside a government building many decades earlier. One was Walter. The other had gone on to become one of the most recognized leaders in modern American history. Several people immediately recognized the face. A collective gasp moved through the diner. Walter gently closed the watch again. "We were young," he said. "We believed service mattered more than recognition." Ryan leaned back slowly. Every assumption he had made that morning now felt painfully small. "You never told anyone." Walter smiled. "Nobody asked the right questions." The answer brought a few embarrassed smiles throughout the room. Yet nobody felt mocked. Somehow Walter managed to make people reflect without making them feel attacked. That was part of what made him extraordinary. The manager's phone rang again. This time nobody jumped. The manager answered quickly, listened, and then looked toward Walter. "The car is almost here." Walter nodded as though confirming an appointment on his calendar. Outside the diner windows, sunlight flooded the parking lot. Several customers turned toward the glass. A dark government vehicle had just entered the lot. Silence returned once more. Not the silence of suspicion, the silence of realization. For the first time all morning, everyone in Miller's diner understood that they had not spent breakfast watching an ordinary elderly man. They had spent it sitting beside a living piece of American history. Walter Brooks stood slowly from the booth and reached for the check. Before he could touch it, Linda gently placed her hand over the receipt and smiled. "It has already been taken care of." Walter looked at her kindly. "Thank you." Around the diner, nobody returned to their meals. Nobody seemed interested in breakfast anymore. The room had become something else entirely. A place where assumptions had quietly given way to understanding. Outside, the dark government vehicle waited beneath the bright morning sun. Its polished surface reflected the storefronts lining Main Street. Walter buttoned his jacket and slipped the old pocket watch back into the inside pocket. The familiar motion felt almost ceremonial now. Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped forward. For several seconds, he searched for the right words. The confidence that had brought him into the diner earlier that morning was gone. What remained was honesty. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "I owe you an apology." Walter looked at him with the same calm expression he had carried all day. "For what?" Ryan lowered his eyes briefly. "For believing I understood who you were before I actually knew anything about you." The diner fell silent again. Walter considered the answer. Then he smiled. "That is a mistake many people make. The important thing is whether they learn from it." Ryan nodded slowly. Those words would stay with him for a very long time. The manager stepped forward next. Then Linda. Then several customers. One after another, they thanked Walter, apologized, or simply shook his hand. Walter accepted every gesture with grace. No anger. No bitterness. No desire to embarrass anyone. The humility seemed to affect people even more than the revelation itself. Finally, Walter turned toward the front door. Sunlight streamed through the glass, filling the diner with warm golden light. He paused for a moment and removed the pocket watch one last time. Opening it carefully, he looked at the faded photograph inside. His smile returned. It was the smile of a man remembering a promise kept across half a century. "We made it," he whispered softly. Nobody asked who he meant. Somehow, everyone understood. Walter closed the watch and slipped it away. Then he stepped outside. The morning air felt fresh and bright. The government vehicle remained waiting quietly near the curb. A suited woman stepped out and greeted him warmly. They exchanged a few words before she opened the rear door. Before entering, Walter turned back toward the diner. Through the large front windows, he could see the faces watching him. Ryan stood near the entrance, Linda beside the counter, the manager near the register, all of them looking out at him differently than they had an hour earlier. Walter raised a hand in farewell. Then he entered the vehicle. As it pulled away down Main Street, the town slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Inside the diner, conversations eventually resumed. Coffee cups were lifted. Plates were cleared. Yet something had changed. On the table by the window where Walter had spent the morning sat a single folded napkin. Ryan noticed it after everyone else. He walked over and opened it carefully. Written in neat handwriting were only a few words. Respect people before you know their story. Ryan read the sentence twice. Then he looked through the window toward the road where the vehicle had disappeared. Sunlight filled the empty booth. And for a long moment, nobody said a word.